My guest again today is Peter Ridd. Should we talk about the vibe shift?
Yeah,
How's
I
that?
think
Yeah.
we should, because I think it's the biggest thing, since the fall of the Berlin Wall. I'm absolutely genuine about that. The world has changed in the last basically year. Climate change is going to be part of that. It's already part of that. Yeah, let's talk about the vibe shift.
I think I was listening to Mark Andreessen on Rogan. I think he called it a preference cascade. I don't know if you heard that one. I think it's part of the vibe shift. Am I right?
Yeah, it,
Yeah.
it is. Yeah, I think so. I mean, everybody's talking about it now, and it's actually one of these things that more people talk about, how suddenly political correctness come wokeness is dying, basically. The more that people talk about that, the more it actually becomes true, because, there's so many. I reckon it's about, 75% of the population have been self-censoring more and more and more, and in the last 5 or 6 years, almost totally. And finally, there's this liberation, which is partly about Trump's victory is probably the biggest of those things. I mean, on your podcast, it's often about climate change, obviously. Climate change is not a scientific issue. It obviously, there's science behind it, but it's mostly a political, ideological issue. It's probably the major part of the culture wars, the so-called culture wars. But of course, there are many other fronts of the culture war, whether it's, the trans ideology, the anti-maleness, the anti-Judeo-Christian tradition, the anti-British Empire, that white men like you and I are just descendants of slaves. And that's so this is all now starting to change and change very rapidly.
Yeah, I was kind of getting the impression that it's U.S. centered, this waking up, but you're telling me Australia's waking up as well. I love it.
I think there's no doubt America is leading this, as always. I mean, I often say America is saving the world, right? It really is. It saved the world to some extent in World War I. It definitely helped save the world in World War II. And its strength since the Second World War, and been a pretty good, world leader. Yes, made some mistakes, but, which major power doesn't make mistakes? But now, with what's happening in America, where the wokeness has been cast out, you've got the most unwoke president coming in history. This is a major change. And we could also talk about this, the change in the young male population have completely rejected wokeness. So yes, America is leading the charge, but it's in Australia, it's in the United Kingdom, it's in Europe, it's in Canada, it's happening everywhere.
I was just talking to Chris Morrison from the UK, and from his perspective, he thinks that maybe UK and Germany might be holdouts, that they might cling to net zero, for example, a little longer than the rest of us.
I think that's true. They probably will, but it's clinging. They're hanging on with their fingernails, and they know in their hearts that they're not going to be able to do it. I mean, you saw in the United Kingdom, they chucked out the appalling Conservative government that pushed them into this net zero. I mean, they voted for net zero by some ridiculous date. And I think the amount of debate in Parliament was, 5 minutes. Maybe it was a bit longer than that, but it wasn't much longer than that. And it wasn't just that, it was, 51 in favour and 49. It was just about everybody in the British Parliament voted for net zero without any costing. And they just did it, right? They didn't think about what they were doing. Now, that was a Conservative government that did that. Now that became extremely unpopular. They then voted in, just because they wanted to change, a Labour government. The British people are now realising, oh my goodness, what have we done? They've got now 4.5 years. So that Labour government is going to be able to do pretty much what it likes, but it's unbelievably unpopular. You see Nigel Farage's Reform Party is now basically level pegging in popularity with the Labour Party, and probably above the Conservatives by many votes. So yes, it's going to be a holdout because the powers still have that. The Labour Party still has that power, but they can see that their voter base, the old working class, are just moving away from them because it's just going to cost too much. The Germans have got an election coming up in February. It'll be interesting to see. They are still pretty well committed to the net zero thing. But again, you can see that it's not going to last. So yeah, they're holdouts. Italy has come across to being relatively sensible. The Austrians are becoming relatively sensible. And we shouldn't just think of this in terms of climate change. You've got to add on all the other things, even the mass immigration, the open southern border. We imported 1 million people last year in the last 2 years into Australia, even though we've only got a population of 25, 26 million. Massive immigration rates. All these things are together, and you're seeing it rejected across Europe, Australia, etc.
So you're saying, and I'm agreeing, that these things come as a package. It's not just climate change. There's a whole package of things, one big package of crazy woke things. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a huge correlation. If you believe that, a man can become a lesbian, if you can believe that, then you have no difficulty believing that the world is going to end. All these things are related. That, there's no problem with massive immigration of people who are undocumented. You don't know who's coming in, that it's okay for boats to be coming across the English Channel, and this is okay somehow. These are all related, and when one of the major bits falls, then all the rest falls. So what's going to happen, I think, in the next year, you're going to be able to see people start to question the whole climate change theory, to be able to say in the mainstream media. University academics are going to, at least in America, are actually going to be able to get funding from the National Science Foundation to do research which demonstrates that there is considerable doubt as to whether we're going to get catastrophic climate change. So these things are going to happen. People are going to be able to stick their head up above the parapet now. And it's not just on one issue, it's on all of them.
So you are seeing that, do you think, that individual scientists, that there is a snowball effect, there's strength in numbers, and they were alone 15, or you were alone, and now you're not alone?
Not yet, but I think we're getting very close to it. For example, we had a case here in Australia. It's not a climate change. But as I said, they're all related, though there is a climate link. We had a crazy case here in Australia where there was a gas pipeline coming in from the Northern Territory, from out at sea into the Northern Territory, and it was stopped because the Aboriginal people claimed that the gas pipeline went across what was called a song line. You see, this is an ancient Aboriginal story that's been handed down for 9,000 years by word of mouth, because there's no written record of this, out to a lake somewhere in about 100 meters water depth. And there the crocodile man, Jirakupai, and the mother serpent, Ampiji, used to live, and the gas pipeline would somehow disturb this thing, right? And the scientists came along and we discovered this lake out there exactly where the Aboriginal people said it would be. And they discovered these burial mounds, 3 kilometers long and 500, half a kilometer wide, out in the ocean at 25 meters depth, right? It was just completely barking mad. And it turned out, in fact, that the scientists had coached the Aboriginal people, basically said, look, if you can claim there's something happening out in the ocean there from 9,000 years ago, over where the gas pipeline goes, so, fossil fuels, then we've got a good chance of stopping the pipe. And they did, right? But then there was a huge court case on it, and the scientists were absolutely crucified. I'll actually read, I've got it here somewhere, what the judge said about one of the scientists. My concerns about one of these scientists, independence and credibility, are such that I would not accept his evidence as sufficient to establish any scientific proposition at all, even if his evidence had gone unchallenged, and even if he possessed the appropriate skills, qualifications, and experience to express them. My conclusions about this scientist, lack of regard for truth, lack of independence, and lack of scientific rigor are sufficient to discount or dismiss all his reports for all purposes. It was a complete wipeout, right? They just went through the scientific so-called evidence. And of course, this got into the newspapers, and people are seeing more and more this is total rubbish. And scientists were coming out to some extent to challenge that. Now, it's got a long way to go, but I think, we're seeing the the new shoots of spring, and that's what I'd expect within a year or two. If you can sort out the scientific institutions, and Trump's going to do that. You look at his, we could discuss this, some of his appointees on the scientific side. They're quite, quite remarkable people that he's appointed.
Yeah, you mentioned, I think, Jay, is it Bhattacharya? That's one great appointment. Yeah, possible. Yeah.
Yeah, so Jay Bhattacharya, I mean, he is an incredible guy. For people who don't know, he was the one who co-authored the Great Barrington Declaration, which basically said that the COVID lockdowns were just a really bad idea, that we were damaging children, that the children were relatively unaffected even by the earlier, more dangerous strains of COVID, and certainly not the sort of the last ones, that locking them down, locking them up has caused so much damage, and that we inverted the responsibility. Old people like me are meant to look out after young people. I look after my grandchildren. That's my job. I'm the guy who literally should jump in front of a bus to help my child. Whereas what actually happened is we protected the old people like me from COVID by locking up the young children. This was just an absolute crime. So we have him. He got into terrible trouble. I mean, he was a Stanford University guy. They basically tried to get rid of him. His name was sullied, but he's done a remarkable job on that. And now I've forgotten what his exact title is, but he's very high up in the medical administration now under the new administration. Then you've got Kennedy. Now he's a bit crazy in some way, maybe on some of the vaccine stuff, but you actually needed somebody who's a little bit out there and different, with a different way of thinking, and he might be a little bit crazy on some of the things. But what he's going to do is he's going to shake up that medical, especially the American medical industry, and ask the questions that need to be asked. It's the same with climate change, that there's all these facts which are just ignored, like, the Holocene climatic optimum was a degree or two hotter. Well, how did that happen? These are the sorts of questions. Now, he's going to be asking those sorts of questions about the medical industry, Bhattacharya. And I've forgotten the names, and there's 2 or 3 others of these real outsiders. Trump is an outsider. I'm an outsider. That's why I was fired from the university at James Cook here, because I was an outsider. So what Trump has done is he has hired the outsiders, and they're going to shake things up, and they're going to make some mistakes. They're going to do some silly things. But everybody knows that things that were hidden are now likely to be uncovered. And that's going to be a huge thing. As they say, these Bhattacharya and Kennedy, these are the guys who know where the bodies are buried. There's going to be massive revelations in the next 4 years about COVID. What happened in China that, we just covered up, and we pretended that no, it didn't come from Wuhan. Or we cover up the fact that the American temperature record has been fudged in the last 100 years to make the 1936, record high summer look less, hot than it actually was. All these things which are happening in the climate debate, or here with the Great Barrier Reef, these sorts of things are going to start to come out.
It's fun for me that you mentioned 1936, because I was just having breakfast with my dad today. He's 96 years old, and he said, it was really hot in 1936. As a farmer, I mean, he was a kid then living on a farm. He remembers it was really hot then. So to fudge that away and say, no, really, it's hotter now, not true.
Yeah, it's an absolute crime that that's been done. I mean, this is now well known. I think, didn't you, Tom, have John Christie on, who actually talked about?
Yep.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's not like Christie is the only one who's saying this. This is a very well-known fact, and that, that there was this huge. I mean, it wasn't just hotter; it was just diabolically hot, 1936, and we don't know why. Why was America so hot in that year? We don't know why, but that's actually only half of it. The real thing is that why was this hidden? And I'm going to apparently go off on a tangent, off on a non-climate change tangent, but it's not, because it's all part of the same thing. You'll doubtless heard of these appalling rape gangs in the United Kingdom, where literally probably 10,000 girls were raped by these mainly Pakistani British men, right? And the scandal is not just the appalling thing that happened, but the cover up by the police, by the politicians, by the councillors. They buried the information. Now, are these related? Yes, they're completely related because these are both part of the culture wars. You're not allowed to talk about some things. You're not allowed to do these things. And the crime is actually often the cover up, not the what you've done. They've covered up the 1936 temperature record in an absolutely scandalous way. And frankly, people should actually go to jail for doing what they have done. In the same way as in England, there's a whole bunch of police officers who covered up what happened in Rotherham and Telford and all these other towns. They covered it up. They should go to jail. And, they're going to actually be a bit worried about some of these things. Some of the scientists who are the head of these organizations, they should be a little bit worried about whether they have been more than just negligent, whether they have been, willfully negligent and therefore culpable of doing all sorts of things. And of course, because they'll be a little bit worried about that, there's still going to be a huge pushback. I mean, I'm saying we're going to win the culture wars, but we haven't won it yet. There's a lot of fighting to do. I sometimes use the analogy as, we've stormed the D-Day beaches. We've got up on the beach. We've now got to fight our way to Berlin. It's not going to be easy. We're going to win if we just keep on going, but there's going to be a lot of fighting before we get there.
What do you think in terms of the social media opening up? And do you think it's going to be harder to cover things up with maybe Facebook opening up even and Instagram recently that Zuck is talking about that? What do you think?
Yeah, it's huge. It's absolutely huge. And it's another example of, how things are swinging our way. I mean, the idea that Zuckerberg has completely changed. Now, why has he changed? I don't know, but I think he genuinely has. And I think whereas that I'm not sure that Bezos has sort of changed for the right reasons, I don't know. Looking at what Zuckerberg has said, he's either an awfully good actor or I think he really realizes that some of what Facebook did was terrible. Of course, Zuckerberg is Jewish and, I did a video on Jewish scientists, which is the best video I've ever made, actually, the staggering contribution. But, Zuckerberg has seen what happened with the reaction of the woke left. You see, if you believe in climate change and that men can turn into lesbians and there's no problem with uncontrolled borders, then you have no difficulty in thinking that Hamas are the good guys, right? That it's the Israelis are the bad guys, and which is just crazy. I mean, Hamas, they're worse than the Nazis were. They literally are worse than that. So you have somebody like Zuckerberg who's just suddenly seen, my goodness, look what the woke left are doing now with regard to Israel. So he has changed. He's come over to our side. And I think you would find that if you ask Zuckerberg a question on climate, he might be a little bit more, well, maybe there is something that maybe it's not as definitive. But yes, for the social media platforms to come across onto our side is an enormous step. And of course, the mainstream media can see this is happening too. You're seeing, for example, in Australia, there's the main newspaper is called The Australian, but they get a lot of articles from the Times of London, which is now, I reckon, just a complete, although it was a very, very solid conservative newspaper, it's now, woke left, hot, terrible. Even in the Times, the articles are coming out where they're realizing that the vibe shift has happened. Facebook's gone over. The Times is going to have to do the same. The New York Times, the Washington Post, they're going to actually have to now start to run a few articles where they, have somebody like Ian Plimer write into them and say, well, maybe climate change isn't a complete catastrophe. And maybe the LA fires, maybe it was a little bit more than just a 1 degree increase in temperature and still less than what it was in 1936. These things are going to happen.
Kind of interesting. You mentioned Ian Plimer. I just had him on my podcast, and it looked to me as I'm watching YouTube analytics that something flipped in the last 2 weeks with YouTube in terms of them showing thumbnails of climate skeptic stuff more than they were. I can look at it. There was a glorious time a couple years ago when they were showing some climate skeptic stuff. Then they shut it off, and now it looks like they may have turned it back on. I don't know if you've seen anything like that. It's changing.
I, yeah, I think it is changing. I've noticed on YouTube that things are coming up which I wouldn't have expected to come up, a couple of years ago, where stuff which I think would often have been buried, where they get their little screwdriver out and they turn down the gains on whether or not this thing will be sent to other people. Things are coming up. I don't know, but that's what I think we'd expect. That although Google hasn't said a great deal about its own contribution to censoring, and they've certainly done that to me with my YouTube channel or my Facebook. Well, Facebook's different. I've had lots of stuff where they've put these community notices up, never actually been banned, fact checked again and again and again. I must have been fact checked at least a dozen times by various, and you'll be surprised to know that I've been wrong on every single one. But yes, I think that things are changing there too. It'll be interesting to see in the next 6 months.
Do you think there's any, do you think COVID kind of saved us somehow, that people saw the lies of COVID? And where would we be right now had COVID not happened? We'd be much more woke, wouldn't we? Do you think?
I think COVID was very important. I don't think it was absolutely crucial. I think the one that really made people think this is mad was the trans issue, where a man can just turn into a she, like a woman, Australian slang. That this was just barking mad. That you either got an XX pronoun or an XY, and there's a infinitesimal number of people who have got something different, right? But people looked at this and they saw people, men just being able to walk into a woman's changing room and compete against women. And even though it's not a big deal unless you're into sport, or for most people it doesn't affect them, it is just completely mad. So I think that was huge. The COVID was huge because you could see that they were just lying, right? That they just lied. That irrespective of what you think about the vaccine efficacy, they kept on saying that the vaccine will stop transmission, right? And, I got vaccinated and I was looking at the figures and everybody was vaccinated and the numbers were sky high, and you could see that it stopped transmission. And then you go onto the TV or somewhere and they say, get vaccinated because it will stop transmission. You think, well, it doesn't, right? It might stop me dying. I'm quite happy to, accept the possibility that it will reduce that and all those sorts of things, especially in old people. But they kept on lying. And the more they lied, the more people thought this is rubbish. And then they think, well, what else? What else are they lying about? I mean, I'll give you an example where it flipped me. My son's a little bit alternative, right? He's a very interesting guy. He's a mixture of hippie and, sort of fairly conservative values. And we had an argument, I don't know, probably 5 years ago, on whether you should put fluoride water, to protect your teeth. And I was a very pro, the authorities say that it helps protect your teeth. And he would say no. Quite a heated argument. Well, I remember after all the COVID stuff, I thought, maybe my son was right about that stuff. And I honestly don't know. But it made me question all of these medical things, even though I was a big deal skeptic on the Great Barrier Reef. And my son said to me, when I said, look, the authorities say fluoridation is good, therefore you do it. He said to me, well, the authorities say the Great Barrier Reef is completely screwed and you don't. So don't use that argument on me. It was a fairly slam dunk. I was pretty well nailed on that one. So I think a lot of people, they saw what happened in COVID and they thought, well, what else? And of course, climate change is one of the what else's, that maybe this is a complete load of twaddle too.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you say that, because I followed a similar path myself on many different issues that I would call myself a normie, where I was believing what the man told me. And now I've been looking into stuff like fluoride and I'm starting to ask questions. So I think there's so much of this happening. I love it. I think it's so healthy.
Yeah. That's right. And I just love the way my son just told me, well, you're the arch skeptic on one thing, and then suddenly you sign up hook, line, and sinker to the official line without any questioning. I was completely nailed. There was nothing I could say.
So I'm hearing a line of reasoning on Twitter that the Zucks of the world, they're just going with, they see which way the wind is blowing. And that is why, since Trump won, now they're going Trump's way. And as soon as a Democrat wins, they're going to fly the other way. But I don't think he's going to do that. What do you think?
No, look, maybe him. I don't think Zuckerberg is in that category. Bezos, maybe. Some of the others, maybe. Look, the fact is that the world is made of about, a bit more than half of the people will just go in whichever direction the wind blows. They just don't care too much. There's half that will be on our side, and there's half that will be on the other side, and they'll dig in, right? And I mean, I've seen this on another case. I fought a battle close to 10 to 15 years ago, trying to get some education reforms in the state of Queensland. And we were fighting the central authorities. I won't go into the detail, but we were told we were dinosaurs. We were ignoring the research. We ended up getting, that we were bad people. We ended up getting a parliamentary inquiry into it, and the parliamentary inquiry agreed entirely with us, completely with us. We won utterly. And what was remarkable was that the central powers, when they saw that both of the political parties actually sided with us, they just switched. All of a sudden, they made all these changes which we'd been suggesting, which were all dinosaur, terrible things. But they then said, these are world-breaking, innovations which we're doing in the state of Queensland into education. So stuff that was, to them just 6 months previously, or maybe a couple of years previously, dinosaur, ultra-right, conservative rubbish, is now innovation. So they could just see, okay, the wind is blowing in this direction, we're going to go in that direction. And of course, this is why that once the vibe shift happens and people see that we're going in this direction, well, then you can't stop it. In the same way as for 50 years, we've been drifting with the tide in the woke direction, and then it went completely crazy in the last 5 years. People are going to see, well, the tide has turned, and I'm going to go back with the tide. And most people will just go along with it, and a lot of us are going to just cheer.
I had one specific question about what's happening in Australia about the Great Barrier Reef and this whole idea that farmers are doing stuff that's killing the reef. Is that still an active thing that you're hearing a lot, or has that faded away?
Yeah, oh no, it's still a thing, but it is fading. So I would regard this as also part of the vibe shift. I'll give you an indication that, the Great Barrier Reef is supposedly being killed by climate change, and it's supposedly being killed by the farmers, right? I'll talk about the climate change one more. That, in the last 3 years, we've had record amounts of coral on the Great Barrier Reef, right? So it turned out we had very few cyclones, we had very few crown-of-thorns starfish plagues, because the amount of coral on the reef goes up and down. Some areas of the reef can vary by a factor of 5 to 10 the amount of coral. Imagine a forest where the number of trees varies by a factor of 5, right? This is sort of what happens with the coral in a way. Well, the last 3 years have been remarkable. We've got twice as much coral as we had, 15 years ago. But at the beginning of this year, we ended up with a couple of big cyclones, and the amount of coral on some of the reef has undoubtedly reduced in the last year or so. The Australian Institute of Marine Science, which put these figures out, and they do a report once a year in the middle of the year, the yearly report. And of course, they have really hated having to report, but I take my hat off to them for doing it, that the previous 3 years, record amounts of coral, but they obviously don't like it. Well, in, I think, September, or was it October this year, they issued an interim report because they'd gone to some fraction of the reef and they'd found this crash in the coral from cyclones. And for the first time ever, they issued an interim report saying, yeehaw, the reef has had another crash of coral, because they love that, right? But it was almost ignored, right? I've got good contacts with the Australian newspaper on this, and I contacted the reporter there, and they said, "Yeah, nobody cares. I'll I'll report it in the middle of the year when they do the big thing." So even there, their efforts to report damage to the reef, people just heard it too much. So I think it's getting better there too.
Do you think the IPCC is going to continue issuing alarming reports, and they're going to have the COP meetings 20 years from now, or what do you see there?
Everybody can. I mean, the COP. Where was it? COP Azerbaijan or wherever it was. uh, it barely got any news play at all, right? Most people didn't even know it happened, right? So that was part of the vibe shift. Everybody could see that, we have one of these every year. They go in their private jets, and it was just a complete non-event. So there's another example of the vibe shift. The IPCC, I think the new head of the IPCC who joined, was it a couple of years ago? What's his name? Skio, I've forgotten.
Yeah.
He came out just after he became head of the IPCC and basically said, 2 degrees is not a catastrophe, and that we've got to, be careful we don't over dramatize it. Now, he wasn't doing it necessarily for all the right reasons. I think that he can see that if you keep saying it's a catastrophe in 5 years, et cetera, and then eventually everybody who's older than about 30 years has said, well, they've said this so many times, we're not going to believe it. I think they can see that they have overcooked it, right? Maybe not the actual, report, the 1,000-page report, but the small ones, the summary for politicians, these are dramatically overcooked, and the IPC can probably start to see that that's happening as well. So I think you're going to expect to see the IPCC itself start to be just a little bit more sensible, but in the end, their jobs depend on a climate catastrophe. Anything less is not going to be good enough.
What do you see as going on in the big picture of who's really pushing this alarmism and this woke stuff? Do you see it as the WEF, the UN, and Bill Gates, and pushing this hard on all of us for some nefarious purpose, or to try to get a central bank digital currency to control us? What do you think?
Look, I think there's no doubt that the elites are not doing us well. I mean, the elites are very, very important. I mean, I'm a bit of a follower of British history, right? And one of the reasons that the British became such a dominant force and actually made America, which has become even more dominant, obviously, was because their elites actually were not doing things just for themselves, right? It was they had a serious Christian ethic to improve the lot. I mean, obviously, a lot of the bastard industrialists, that they were just there to make money, but there was the people who got rid of slavery, William Wilberforce, and the British Parliament that voted to get rid of slavery and then eliminated it around the world. An absolutely remarkable thing. This was the elites who were pushing that. I have to say, with the great support of the bone poor British people, that they did that. So your elites are important. The American elites in the rise of America were remarkable people. And even your Musks and your Zuckerbergs, these are important people. But on the other hand, you can certainly see how these elites now have got a fair amount of contempt for the poor people. This is what the WEF is all about. You have to be, at least a twin-engine private jet to be able to go to Davos, right? This is not for the poor people. And there is a definite disgust. I mean, here in Australia, we call, the average sort of working class person who live in the western suburbs of Sydney or somewhere, we call them bogans, right? Right. And it's sort of a little bit derogatory. They drive a V8 ute, that's a pickup truck. They watch the footy, and these people we're contemptuous. The elites are contemptuous of them. And the bogans are picking up on this, right? They can see that, well, the Labor Party, the left-wing parties are now, they don't care about the working class anymore. They're part of the elite. They consider the working class as bogans. That's what the WF is about. And a lot of the UN stuff is. So is it a conspiracy? Well, not really in the normal sense, but But I reckon that the United Nations now is one of the most corrupt, horrible institutions there is, and probably we should withdraw from almost all parts of it.
So yeah, I do see the whole climate scam as a war on real people with real jobs. But we're agreeing that those real people are picking up on this, and that's one reason why they're rejecting the climate scam, right?
Yeah, yeah, totally. So you're seeing in the United Kingdom, for instance, that the working class people, after the election of the Labour Party, they suddenly switched. They suddenly switched to the New Reform Party. The Brexit vote. Now, is Brexit part of the climate change war? Absolutely, right? The Brexit was, we are fed up with this European Union, essentially an undemocratic organisation, telling the British people what to do. And the people who voted against for Brexit to leave the European Union were largely the working class people. They actually, and of course the Conservatives, then they squandered that huge shift. We saw it here in Australia. We had a referendum last year on whether or not we should essentially give Indigenous people a special place in the Constitution and essentially virtually a separate parliament. And everybody said, oh, this is going to go through, it's going to be a 70% are going to vote in favour of it, and that's the way the opinion polls looked. And of course, what happened was that when people started to find out that this is really serious, you're messing around with the Constitution in a terrible way, they went across. And it was the working class people, the people who actually would normally vote for the Labour Party, who actually were proposing this constitutional amendment. It was the working class people who voted against that change. This is part of the culture war. It's part of the climate change. It's part of all these other things. It's part of the vibe shift. We voted massively against it. Up here in North Queensland, it was like 75% against it. In some of the seats, it was over 90% against this. It was only the inner city elites that voted for it. That was the only place where it happened. So yeah, there was another example where the bogans, they just said, no, we're having not a bar of this. And when you start to jack up the price of petrol, the price of the gas, the price of gas for cooking, start restricting how they can move inside a city, the 15-minute city, whether or not some person who lives in some, northern city, cold city in England is allowed to fly down to the south of France because, we're going to restrict those sorts of things and put tax on airfares. Now the bogans are going to turn around and say, no, we've had enough of this stuff. And they're going to vote against it. And it's happening.
So do you spend a lot of time thinking about this whole issue of money printing to finance forever wars and debasing the currency for the working people?
Well, yeah, to some extent. I mean, I've got to admit that if we go back to the wars that America has been fighting, and America's actually, even though I think it's a remarkable country and, as the world's policeman, it's done an incredibly good job. But it has made some pretty bad mistakes, I think, in the Middle East. And you got to wonder why. Is it because the American government does, there is a bit too much corruption of the military industrial complex and all the rest of it? Yes, I do worry about that. I worry about the digital currency as well. That is truly frightening. But I probably worry a little less about it now than I did before this vibe shift, because provided people can talk about how it's used, then I think you're in a lot better position to control it. Yeah.
So do you think there's ever going to be enough vibe shift that the people who fired you from James Cook are going to say, sorry, we shouldn't have done that?
Yeah, I do. I think it's going to be 10 to 15 years. Yeah, I do. I think that eventually people are going to look back and there's going to be a whole lot of people where, I mean, I don't need an apology or anything, just an acceptance that things were done wrong in Australia, in the university. But it's not just me. I mean, it's not like I'm the only one. There's lots of us who are in a bit of a state on this. So yeah, I think it is definitely going to happen. I mean, one of the reasons is that this vibe shift is really in the younger people now. I'm getting a little bit off track, I guess, but You know, the way that the young males voted for Donald Trump is just a staggering statistic because they're going to be fairly sensible um, for the rest of their lives. They've completely rejected it. They're the guys who've gone to the universities and seen all the indoctrination, the same people who effectively got rid of me and, you know, the Jordan Petersons and the others. These were their lecturers and they've just rejected all of this.
So if you kind of reran that experiment again, and you said similar things, or someone like you said similar things now versus when you actually did, totally different reaction. Am I right? You know what I mean?
I I think I wouldn't say I don't think the vibe shift has moved along enough yet to be a totally different reaction.
Okay.
But yes, I do think that if I said what I said, which was essentially that some of the work coming out of other Great Barrier Reef science institutions was not trustworthy because there wasn't enough quality assurance done on their work, right? In other words, they didn't have quality assurance processes, ergo the work couldn't be trusted. Not that it was wrong, not that it was fraudulent. I think I would definitely be able to get away with that now. Um, I mean, one of the reasons was that we actually in Australia, because the High Court challenge, which I technically lost in the sense that I wasn't able to be reappointed, but we won on the main point, which was that I actually had academic freedom and the university acted unlawfully in censuring me. Right. Now, they would then said, well, they still had a right to fire me because they told me to shut up about their unlawful activity, so that they sort of won well, they did win on a technicality, basically. But we got written into, you know, precedent law. We got written in there that I've got academic freedom. And by the way, that is now being used. That's been used since then. So there is been a case on another very contentious issue where an academic has been able to use our court, which we won the main legal aspects on academic freedom, is now being used by other academics. So yeah, that things have already improved in that regard, at least in Australia.
So I'd like to shift gears. I have something totally different to ask you about. I've been watching this show from Graham Hancock on Netflix called Ancient Apocalypse. It's 2 seasons long. He's talking about the deep human history, and I think you've talked about that too. He has this idea that the Younger Dryas hit us, and maybe we had some sort of technological advances back before that. We got almost wiped out by this terrible event. Do you have any thoughts on whether that may have happened? Maybe there really was a great flood caused by something, pieces of a comet hitting us, something like that?
Well, I think the crucial thing about these things is we actually don't know. I mean, it's
Yeah.
quite possible. Yeah. I mean, but we don't know. I mean, we worry about, oh, well, the temperature's increased by maybe a degree in the last 100 years. All right, we can argue whether it's half a degree or whatever, but it's a teensy-wincy amount. And then you go back and you look at all the vast changes in the last, say, 18,000 years. You know, the 10-degree increase from since the peak of the last glacial maximum. All those changes, we actually don't understand any of them. Sure, we know that the major swings of the ice ages, the glacials, are probably linked with the Milankovitch cycles. But Milankovitch cycles are these beautiful, smooth sinusoids. But this climate's done this, you know, massive changes in just 100 years. And we understand none of them. We don't. So we've got a situation, we've got this massively varying system, which we completely don't understand and completely can't predict. It's fascinating to delve into and speculate and why, but we don't. And then we get this 1 degree change and we say this must be human induced. You know, this is, I think, the main point about the Younger Dryas or the Holocene climatic optimum, or all these other events that happened, 30,000 years ago or 40,000 years ago, where suddenly the temperature just jumped up. Why did it do any of these things? We don't know.
What tips do you have for us on how to succeed on social media? I can see that you are doing very well on YouTube, for example. What are you doing that's working?
Well, I think you've just got to give people things that they don't already know. That's all that I can suggest. That, if you keep on hashing the same stuff to your same audience, well, they've seen it before. You've got to genuinely give them facts that they don't know about. Like, for example, at the moment, I'm starting a series on climate change and on how we don't understand, for example, the clouds, right? The clouds are an incredibly important part of the way that the climate works. They reflect incoming solar radiation, but also they trap the outgoing infrared radiation. We don't understand how clouds form. We don't understand why some clouds will rain and some clouds won't rain. We got rough ideas. We certainly don't understand how much rain will come out of a cloud. Now, why is that important? Well, it's phenomenally important because the biggest greenhouse gas is water vapor, and water vapor, the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere depends on those machines we call clouds, which take water vapor that's evaporated mainly from the sea and chuck it back either onto the ground or to the sea. And the more effective they are at doing that, the more they remove water vapor from the atmosphere, the biggest greenhouse gas. So these are incredibly important things, right? So, we could talk more about these changes and the other things which we don't understand in climate change. But getting over those interesting facts, which most people don't know about. For example, you mentioned the younger dryas. Most people don't know about the younger dryas, right? They don't know about these massive phenomenal shifts of the past. They don't know that the Sahara Desert just a few thousand years ago, had a lot of grassland on it, that Lake Chad was 20 times bigger. It's a big lake now, and it was 20 times bigger just a few thousand years ago. We don't know any of those sorts of things. So just getting across new facts again and again and again to people, I think is what drives people, and also to try to get the message over very, very quickly. The best videos I've done, actually, even though I'm into climate and Great Barrier Reef stuff, were actually on the British contribution to science and the Jewish contribution to science. And I gave a whole lot of facts that most people don't know about what the British did and what they invented and what the Jews have invented. And, that's my best video. And I think it's simply, there was a whole lot of interesting facts.
So I think you mentioned there might be some sort of a renaissance of climate science coming, where instead of funding just alarmism, that people will start funding, what is happening with clouds and that type of thing.
Yeah, and it's completely needed that we start to do that. Now, I have a suspicion that, I'm a physicist, right? And, if you actually go into very complicated systems, and actually not even very complicated systems, if you have a pendulum, a weight on the end, I've just pulled this up, on the end of a pendulum, you can predict what's going on there relatively easily. But if you have two pendulums, so you have one rod and then you have another rod and a weight on the end, then just that simple system becomes so unbelievably chaotic that you cannot predict what it will be doing in a minute's time, just a simple pendulum, right? Because the sensitivity to the initial conditions, even though you know the physics exactly. Now, climate is an unbelievably complicated system, and it may well be that it's just completely unpredictable, and it will always be unpredictable. That even if we understand the basic physics at the droplet scale of clouds, that you will never be able to get there. But the problem at the moment is that if you put in an Australian Research Council or an American NSF proposal to study clouds, and there's any whiff that you might be a climate change denier, well, up to now you'd have some problems. But I suspect that if you're a young fella now, you're in your 30s, that you'd now be able to write a proposal where, I mean, I wouldn't, because the powers that be are still stacked in the science, but maybe not in America in a year or two's time. But a young person would be able to write a proposal where they would genuinely be able to look at that, and provided they didn't out themselves as a complete climate change denier, I think they'd actually have a reasonable chance. And that would be a really great thing, because, there are all these very, very complicated things which we need to understand. I mean, on the Great Barrier Reef, the main reason why we shouldn't be too worried about the Great Barrier Reef is when you look at the history, the geological history of it. Now, up until, say, the year 2000, there was a lot of marine geologists looking at the geological history, you know, the sea level going up and down. We saw the Great Barrier Reef being wiped out and then grow back and wiped out and grow back, and the rivers run through them. And you could get a great deal of information about how the reef worked and why it's not going to be affected by climate change or the farmers, right? But of course, that then became, we don't want to listen to that because it's saying that the reef is fine. And all those scientists, almost every single one of them, ended up having to go on to other things because they couldn't get funded. Now I think you can see a time where we can get that good basic science back, especially in America, because you're going to have Jay Bhattacharya and RFK, who are going to be largely in charge of some very, very important organizations.
Do you have any hope at all that AI can help us somehow to understand the clouds or anything else with climate, or no?
Look, I think AI in terms of weather prediction, is huge, right? It's huge. And the reason, you got to remember how AI works. It's not intelligent. It's just mega statistics, right? And getting inferences out of enormous data sets. And of course, we have enormous data sets on weather. We're recording, you know, with satellites, the temperature at various layers, the water vapor at various layers, the wind at various layers. And we've been doing this for a couple of decades now. So we've got vast amounts of data on day-to-day weather every, I don't know, half an hour or whatever. And therefore you can build your models to get better and better weather predictions. So my colleague, Jennifer Marhassi, pushes this a great deal. On the other hand, for longer term climate things, I don't think it's going to be much good because we don't have those mega data sets to train the AI models, right? So, you know, climate, well, we know roughly what it was 100 years ago and sort of a little bit what it was 1,000 years ago in some places. And we know it was hotter 5,000 years ago, but we've really only got one curve and it's not enough information. It's not even within cooey of enough information to do that. So no, I don't think, and of course this is one of these predictions which is very likely to be proven wrong, but essentially AI needs mega data sets. We don't have mega data sets. Maybe if we can get it somehow, those mega data sets from, you know, we got data of climate from seabed records and those sorts of things, but it's still very, very sparse. So otherwise you're going to need to actually understand the physical processes, and we don't understand the physical processes. So that's where I'd go. I'd be looking at clouds. I'd be getting people to work on the deep convection in the tropics, which is completely almost ignored. The tropics actually drives the world climate. It sets the temperature gradient from the top of the atmosphere to the bottom. It's the you know, the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship and the way that essentially the way that the water vapor turns into droplets in the massive updrafts in the tropics. That actually sets what happens even, you know, in the colder climates. We almost ignore tropical climatology, tropical weather. We don't understand why sometimes these systems get going really, really well. Now, that probably can be, the day-to-day weather probably can be improved, the predictions by AI, but over a longer period, no, I'm not sure it can do it.
Do you have any brief thoughts on what's going on with cloud seeding, or people that think the Earth is too warm, so they're trying to block out the sun with some experiments, or whether the emissions from commercial planes are a little bit different now than they were in the 1970s, so maybe contrails are lasting longer? Do you have any thoughts on any of that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not too worried about if people want to do a bit of cloud seeding. From my reading of it, if it has any effect, it's very, very marginal. You know, it's really not going to make a big difference. I mean, planes are certainly a lot cleaner in terms of their particulate emissions. So I would imagine that if there is a change in the contrails, it would actually be less than what it was, except there's now a lot more aeroplanes, so maybe that counteracts it. But this is one of these things we don't understand. We know that if you get a high enough error, we knew since the Americans flew, in the Second World War with their B-17s at a very high altitude, that you would get contrails from just about any engine, right? So we've known this for a long time, but it's part of this whole cloud paradox about what forms a cloud and whether it will rain and all the rest of it. It's stuff which we should be researching, and we should be, in the scientific community, we've got far too few hard scientists worrying about important things like that, where you need to understand basic physics, and too many, some environmental studies person they do climate science. So what they do is they take a possum, they cook it and say, it died when I gave it 20 degrees, therefore it's going to be it's complete rubbish stuff. A lot of very, very second-rate scientists doing basically complete rubbish science. We need more really good science, worrying about contrails and clouds and things like that.
Do you worry that a lot of people went into climate science, they were all in on alarmism, and that's why they went into it, and now they've been in 5 or 10 years? Do you worry that it's hard to get real science out of those people?
You'll never get real science out of it. Most of them are utterly second-rate. They're not even second-rate, most of these people. They are mostly completely innumerate. They know zero physics and zero chemistry, but they're probably highly articulate and can play the political game and write the applications like a master. So this is one of the problems that's happened in science, that somebody, an introverted bumbler like Einstein, or a complete fruitcake like Newton. I mean, he was a complete strange guy. There is no way that somebody like that would be able to make it in the modern scientific system. You've got all these second-raters who are pretending to do science, and they're the ones who can get their way to the top. So this is one of the, like so many of our institutions, the scientific institutions need a complete clean out. And I think we genuinely are on the cusp of seeing that happen, at least in America. We're away from that in Australia, but believe me, where America goes, we follow pretty much. So we look into the Americans at the moment.
So, I mean, we have this peer-reviewed system that's broken. Do you think there's any hope that there's some sort of meritocracy in social media where you can be a weird guy, but your ideas are fantastic, that you can somehow, your merit causes you to rise up and people will find out that what you're saying makes sense?
Yeah, I think that people are seeing that groupthink is the genuine enemy, that what peer review actually is a system for making groupthink. That's what it is. I'm not saying that you don't need peer review at some level, but if you had to devise a system to make groupthink, you would say, well, we will make sure that nobody can get anything published or get any funding unless they give that work to a group of their peers, right? To agree with it. And unless they agree with it, it will not go ahead. That is just the recipe for groupthink. And I think people can see that. They can see that groupthink, the peer review on the Wuhan COVID, that yes, I don't think there's a tinsy bit of doubt that it didn't come out of that lab, right? Just a tinsy bit. But the scandal is not that, well, it came out, they made a complete stuff up and they killed, 5 million people or whatever they did, right? It's the way that the whole scientific authority tried to cover it up in their little groups, and people could see it happen there, and they can think, well, it's probably happening everywhere. What systems are we going to put in place to try to make it so that an Isaac Newton can pop up, can be hit on the head by an apple and say, I think gravity goes downwards towards any mass, and that he won't be saying, oh, you're just a complete loon. That's where we've got to get to.
All right. Very good. We're up to the end of our hour here. Anything else before we wrap up?
No, I think it's just that, except that I have never felt more optimistic in my whole life. I'm genuinely, utterly thrilled by what's going on at the moment in the world. Things are looking up.
All right. That makes me very happy that you're saying that. So thanks for all you're doing, and I'll talk to you next time. Peter Ridd.
My pleasure.